Thank you very much, Simon, and I want to thank Dirk as well for making the arrangements for this meeting and Liam for his support. I think this is the first time I've been to the ODI, and I want to express my appreciation for the excellent work the ODI has done over the years and how we have at the UN benefited from this. Let me go straight to the subject since we have very little time. And I have a fairly extensive PowerPoint presentation, but much of this has been made easier by Paul's excellent comprehensive introduction to the issues. So let me focus a little bit on what I see as the major challenges going forward. I think one of the major challenges, as Paul has indicated, is the whole question of adequate financing for development. And we have a situation where there is clearly a felt need for significantly scaled up financing for development. JBIC, for example, the Japan Bank of International Cooperation, which is now part of JICA, has estimated that needs to be over 700 billion per annum for Asia alone. And if we look at what comes out of the Asian Development Bank, it is a small fraction of that amount. And so you see very, very severe shortages on that front. Secondly, I think it is now well known that many people in developing countries believe that the kinds of transformations which have taken place over the last 3 decades have not exactly been very development friendly. They have reduced policy space, and also very significantly, as suggested by Paul earlier, fiscal space has been improved, has been constrained. Thirdly, and very importantly, there are a whole range of failures of international cooperation which need to be addressed. In the area of trade, we all know the problems there. We know the problems of taxation, where there is really limited international tax cooperation, and for developing countries, increased information alone is not going to make all that much difference. Problems of technology associated with the de facto strengthening of TRIPS obligations in bilateral trade and investment agreements and so on and so forth. Problems of debt resolution. I think the international community threw the baby out with the bathwater when Mrs. Kruger's proposals almost a decade ago were rejected. And then we have the issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation, where we have clearly, I think now, a greater sense of need after the tragedy of Pakistan, where 20 million people were displaced just a couple of months ago. Now, moving on very quickly, I think we also do know that coming out of Monterrey and reiterated in Doha in 2008, there are a range of issues which were previously identified as financing for development issues. These were mentioned partly, the whole question of domestic resource mobilization, especially taxation, the question of trade, aid effectiveness issues are of course a major concern, debt workout issues I've already mentioned, access to international capital, and one should distinguish this from capital account liberalization, because there is no evidence that capital account liberalization has actually enhanced access to capital for developing countries, especially for the poorest countries. And then the range of systemic issues, including governance issues, which have been mentioned. Let me skip over Secretary General's proposal on a global Green New Deal, as important as I believe this is for moving forward in a very significant way in terms of some kind of a reasonably comprehensive step out of the dilemma which the world is facing now as a consequence of the availability of cheap credit in the earlier period, overinvestment, and as a consequence of that overinvestment, overcapacity in the current period, and a reluctance of the private sector to invest in most sectors because of this overcapacity, and hence a need to move private sector investments into new areas. And we particularly see the whole question of renewable energy as a major investment. But the poorest countries, the most energy poor countries, do not have the means to make those kinds of investments. They do not have the means to put their growth paths on the basis of a renewable energy infrastructure, and hence it becomes extremely important to be able to facilitate this. And this can be done through international cooperation, not only public-private partnerships, but doing what are, for example, feed-in tariff systems, which now operate at a national level in Germany, in Spain, and a number of other countries. They can be internationalized, perhaps between Europe and Africa, for instance, or other types of arrangements can be made. where it then becomes possible for the poorest countries, or what Alan referred to as the low-income countries, being put on growth paths on the basis of renewable energy. This is a real possibility, and this is one of the areas where the G20 can provide very, very significant leadership. Now, we do know also that many of the achievements of the G20 so far have been largely development friendly, and I won't go through this list here. You've heard about them in the media, and some of them have been mentioned also by Paul. But I think it's also important to recognize what is still undone, and to distinguish between what is in process, in the sense that there is continuing work. I do think there is some work going on the regulation issues, for example, some work in some of the other areas as well. But also we have to recognize what is not being addressed. And we need to begin to recognize that we have had, as a consequence of the crisis, a real challenge, because we had briefly at least a Bretton Woods moment, a moment where the international community could have risen to the challenge of the crisis to bring about some kinds of fundamental reforms and to rise to the expectations of Bretton Woods, where Bretton Woods, as you all know, was not just about re-establishing monetary and financial stability. It was also about creating the conditions for growth, economic growth on the one hand, but also of employment generation, recognizing the fundamental importance of decent work for livelihoods on the one hand, but also human dignity. And then related to that, of course, creating the conditions for post-war reconstruction and post-colonial development. This was all part of the Rooseveltian mission and vision of what was to be achieved at Bretton Woods, which was called, by the way, the United Nations Conference on Monetary and Financial Issues, even though the United Nations did not exist yet until 1945 at San Francisco. So this was certainly a very strong commitment on the part of President Roosevelt in terms of inclusive multilateralism, which was not, which was in contrast, for example, if I may say so, to Churchill's view. Churchill had at that time preferred a bilateral arrangement between the US and the UK. Now, if I may, there are a number of areas. Paul has mentioned quite a number of them. I just flashed them on the screen here. But one major gap is how do we try to establish or re-establish, because there was a sense of this in the post-war golden age, if you will, between the 50s and the 50s and 60s in particular. How do we re-establish institutions and policies which are consistently counter-cyclical? How do we ensure that we avoid the kinds of boom-bust cycles which Alan has correctly pointed out are so debilitating, especially for the lowest income countries? This, I think, is a very, very major challenge. The French presidency is expected to take up the whole question of international monetary system reform, and I wish them very well, because I think this is very fundamental. And the one possibility, of course, is the possibility of doing SDR emissions in a way which address liquidity issues, but also maybe potentially counter-cyclical, and very importantly, potentially developmental. And I do hope that the French presidency will be able to think of some of these issues and how we may move forward on this. Two other issues Paul has mentioned: the importance of tax cooperation, and I've already mentioned earlier the importance of debt workout mechanisms, which really do not exist right now. We also have to look very critically and carefully at whether some of the purported initiatives to address these problems are really adequate or really development friendly. Let me give you the example of Basel III. Many of the features of Basel III do not overcome some of the problems of Basel II, which was considered much more development unfriendly, and Stephanie Griffith-Jones is here and she has written extensively on this. But Basel III will continue, in fact, deepen some of the problems, and will not necessarily ensure a system, a banking regulatory system which will be much more friendly towards financing development. There are, of course, as we know, a number of concerns about the financial services agreement of the GATS in the WTO, which also need to be addressed. and I would also mention the TRIPS problems in a range of other issues. In other words, we have a number of issues which need to be addressed. I think we have to recognize that at this point, the membership of the G20 wants to keep the G20 essentially focused around financial issues. You will notice that there is no G20 trade ministers meeting so far, for instance. And so this focus around financial issues is very welcome, because we've never had something of this scale before, whereas the G7 arrangements were of a different character. But the whole question of how we bring about those changes, and whether these changes are going to be very, very significant and be more development friendly, is a fundamental issue which is going to which will be partially addressed with Seoul, but there will be great expectations as to how they can be furthered under the French presidency. The French presidency's decision to co-chair the development working group together with South Africa and Korea is most welcome in this regard. But it is very important that we do not look at development in isolation, but very much in conjunction with the range of other issues which are being addressed by the finance ministers. And so the interaction between the development working group, which is right now connected to the leaders and through the Sherpas, with what is happening with the finance ministers, will be a very important challenge in the time ahead. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, especially Jomo, for the substance, but also for giving us a little bit of time to engage with Alan before he goes, and then we can pick up